In the archives of the British East India Company, there is a document that records a silence as savage as any battlefield. It is a shipping manifest. On this single piece of paper, listed with the clinical indifference of a grocery list, are 2 items destined for the same port: 12 cases of holy Bibles and 2,000 chests of opium. One was meant to save the soul, the other was designed to shatter the body. But notice what this manifest does not include: apology, justification, or the slightest editorial discomfort. The 2 entries share a column, they share a font, they share the same ink, dried by the same hand, filed by the same clerk who went home that evening, and, in all likelihood, said his prayers before bed. There is no asterisk, no marginal note, no sign that anyone in the chain of paperwork paused for even a breath. This is the inventory of an empire that built a throne on poison and called it progress. We often think of history through the clean lines of a textbook, the confident captions beneath portraits of men in powdered wigs, the dates arranged like stepping stones across a river that never floods. But the story of the British Empire in China resists that kind of order. It is not a chapter of political history. It is a study of how a human being and an entire nation can maintain power by wearing a mask of divine favor and humanitarian truth. It is a study of how the mask, worn long enough, stops being a disguise and becomes a self-portrait. In the 16 minutes, we are stripping away the sanitized legends of the Civilization Project. You are going to discover how the world's most powerful empire turned an entire sovereign nation into a private battlefield of survival. You'll see how millions of lives were catalogued, rationed, and destroyed with the same indifference a factory owner applies to a broken machine. Not with rage, not with hatred, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who has simply stopped counting people as people. We're going to look at the mechanism, the machinery of noble language wrapped around profitable violence that is still running in our world today, even if we don't always recognize it. This isn't just about drugs. It's about how perception is the army, and if you win the war of how things are described, you never have to win the war on the ground. To understand the monster, we must first look at the hero. In the early 1800s, Britain was the self-appointed guardian of the civilized world. They had defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. Their navy patrolled every ocean. Their philosophers were publishing essays on liberty, on the rights of man, on the moral duty of the enlightened nation to lift the benighted ones. The Royal Navy flew its flag as a kind of movable principle, not merely a military force, but a symbol, and symbols wielded with enough institutional authority and enough repetition eventually become facts. You stop questioning a flag, you start saluting it. But beneath this gleaming facade of moral authority, Britain had a wound, an administrative problem that refused to heal, no matter how many committees were appointed to study it. Britain had an insatiable hunger for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. The tea alone had become so embedded in British daily life that it was no longer a luxury, it was infrastructure. Entire social rituals had organized themselves around the cup. The afternoon had been restructured around it, and yet the Qing dynasty, ancient, self-contained, and deeply suspicious of foreign ambition, wanted nothing from the West. They viewed British manufactured goods as primitive imitations of things China had mastered centuries earlier. Emperor Qianlong had written to King George with a serene dismissal that still lands like a slap across the face of empire. China, he explained, possessed all things in prolific abundance. There was nothing it required from the barbarian merchants pressing at the edge of the world. This was not mere arrogance. It was, economically, accurate. And so the silver was flowing out of London and into the vaults of Beijing, and the British treasury was bleeding from a wound it could not close through ordinary commerce. For a nation built on the principle that trade was civilization, that commerce was the highest expression of human progress, this wasn't merely an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. So they looked for a variable, a mechanism to tilt the scales. They found it in the poppy fields of Bengal. This was not the work of desperate men or reckless adventurers operating outside the law. It was the calculating machinery of a board of directors, men with ledgers and lawyers, and a board of trade who met in panelled rooms in London and made decisions that would hollow out a civilization from the inside. The East India Company realized that if they couldn't sell wool or iron to China, they could sell addiction. And addiction, unlike wool, generates its own demand. It recruits its own customers. It expands its market from the body outward, one ruined night at a time. They organized what we might call a system of rational violence. Violence not of passion, but of the spreadsheet. Violence that never raised its voice, because it never needed to. The numbers, if you trusted them, told a story of progress. The numbers did not include the bodies. Think about the audacity of what this required. A company that held, as part of its founding charter, the sacred duty of civilization, the expansion of trade, the spread of the gospel, the ordering of the uncivilized world, was now operating as the most sophisticated drug cartel in human history. How do you tell the world you're a philanthropist while you're smuggling poison? The answer, it turns out, is surprisingly simple. You control the language. You control it completely. And you begin before anyone has thought to object. Like Leopold II of Belgium, who transformed the Congo into a private abattoir while presenting himself to Europe as a humanitarian savior. The architects of the opium trade understood that a mask does not merely conceal the truth, it replaces it in the public imagination. If the replacement is sustained long enough, with enough institutional authority behind it, the original truth becomes the fringe position. It becomes the thing that needs to be proven, while the lie rests comfortably as the default. They didn't call it drug trafficking. They called it the opening of China. They spoke of free trade, diplomatic equality, and the providential mission to bring the gospel to the East. These phrases were not accidentally chosen. They were engineered. Each one performed a specific function. Free trade made the violence sound like liberation. Diplomatic equality made coercion sound like fairness. Providential mission made exploitation sound like God's own plan. The empire as instrument of divine will. This was the theater of civilization. Production running simultaneously in London drawing rooms and Chinese harbor towns, with entirely different experiences depending on which side of the curtain you stood on. While British ships were dumping thousands of tons of opium into Chinese ports, triggering a social collapse so severe that entire cities were described by their own magistrates as wastelands of ash and silence, where fathers sold daughters and officials smoked through their morning appointments. The press in London was publishing pamphlets about the barbaric Chinese emperor who refused to embrace the benefits of trade. The reversal is total. The addict becomes the aggressor. The pusher becomes the civilizer. The victim in this retelling is the empire. They wielded a weapon more dangerous than any gun: the ability to control the narrative of a crime while it was still being committed. When Chinese officials, desperate, watching their population dissolve, finally fought back, seizing and burning over 20,000 chests of opium on the shores of Canton, Britain, didn't see a nation defending its people. They saw an insult to the crown. They saw a violation of property rights. They saw, in other words, exactly what they had prepared themselves to see. The First Opium War was not a war of soldiers facing soldiers across a field of shared risk. It was a machine designed to extract a demonstration of technological violence so overwhelming that resistance wasn't defeated so much as rendered absurd. The British Navy, the most advanced military force on Earth, arrived not to conquer territory in the conventional sense, but to enforce a debt that China had never agreed to incur. Imagine the specific daily texture of a coastal Chinese village in the summer of 1840. 1840, you have lived by the sea for generations. Your grandfather fished these waters. Your children play in the shadow of the same hills your great-grandmother knew. The rhythms of your life are older than the British nation itself. And then, on a morning that begins like any other morning, iron-clad monsters appear on the horizon. Ships unlike anything in your world, moving without sails, breathing smoke, carrying guns that fire from a distance you cannot close. They are not there to govern you. They are not there to speak to you. They are there to ensure that your father, your brother, and your son continue to buy the poison that is turning your city into a gallery of the half-alive. The British fired their weapons and expected, in return, a ledger entry that balanced. The accounting required proof of compliance. In this case, the proof wasn't a basket of severed hands, as in the Congo, but a treaty signed at gunpoint, dressed in the language of law. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842, was the paperwork of civilization. It forced China to pay 21 million silver dollars in reparations for the opium that China had seized and destroyed, opium that had been smuggled illegally into their own country. The logic is worth sitting with for a moment. China was compelled to compensate Britain for the loss of contraband. The victim paid the pusher. Beyond the money, China was forced to cede Hong Kong to the British Crown, and 5 major ports were pried open to British trade under conditions no sovereign nation would accept freely. Most crucially, British citizens operating in China were granted extraterritoriality, meaning they could not be tried under Chinese law, regardless of what crimes they committed on Chinese soil. This was not a peace treaty, it was a franchise agreement. Britain had issued itself a license to continue the enterprise, with the added security of legal immunity. Why does a hero nation turn into a predator? Is it madness? Is it some moral degeneracy we can locate and quarantine safely from our own inheritance? The men who ran this trade were not monsters in the way we usually permit ourselves to imagine monsters. They were articulate and charming in company. They were generous to their churches. They funded hospitals. They wrote letters to their mothers. Some of them were intellectually curious men who genuinely believed, or allowed themselves to believe, that opening China to trade was a form of grace, that the discomfort of transition was a temporary tax on a longer dividend of civilization. This is, perhaps, the most disturbing detail in the entire inventory. Not that they were evil, but that they were comprehensible. They survived the moral scrutiny of their contemporaries because the people around them had every incentive to believe the public performance. The economic theory of free trade, articulated by philosophers they admired, taught in universities they had attended, provided the intellectual scaffolding for what the body already knew was wrong. They calculated the implications of their actions not in human lives, but in property portfolios, market positions, and the annual reports of the East India Company, whose shareholders included members of parliament, members of the clergy, and members of the press. The mask, in other words, was not worn only by the perpetrators. It was worn by everyone who needed not to see. Here is the most horrifying truth. We want this to be a singular aberration, a rabid animal of history, safely caged in the past, clearly labeled, clearly condemned. We want the clean chapter break, the moment where the textbook announces, and then humanity learned. But the evidence will not support that comfort. The British didn't just exploit China. They exploited the language in which China was discussed. They turned addiction into market demand. They transformed a drug war into a mission of progress. And in doing so, they handed down to every subsequent empire a working blueprint. Capture the institutions that are supposed to check power. Journalism, diplomacy, international law, and the crime becomes the record. The massacre becomes the intervention. The extraction becomes the gift. The real horror isn't just the millions of lives lost to addiction and war. It is the mechanism itself, the demonstration repeated across centuries and continents that power does not need to be brutal to be devastating. It only needs to be legible as something else. King Leopold II, the Marshal of France, the merchants of the Opium Wars, the boardroom in London on a Tuesday afternoon in 1835, where men in good coats decided how many chests of poison to ship to Canton that quarter. They all understood one thing: ultimate cruelty does not announce itself. It does not arrive with fangs showing. it arrives wearing the most sacred symbols available to it: the cross, the crown, or the spreadsheet. The Philanthropy of Opium is a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable precisely because they do not lie. This one reflects the question we are always slowest to ask: not how could they do this, but how many people had to look away for them to keep doing it. Britain didn't just poison a nation, they poisoned the record of history itself, wrapping their violence in the noble language of improvement. Until the improvement was all most people could see. Until the shipping manifest, filed quietly in an archive, began to look like nothing more than a list. If this investigation into the sanitized legends of empire gave you a new perspective on the machinery of power, on the way noble language is used to launder profitable violence, then let this be the beginning of a longer inquiry. Hit the subscribe button, because next, we are stripping away the mask of another hero of history. I'll see you in the next investigation.